The woman on the phone asked me to confirm my identity for the refinancing paperwork we finalized last month, and I remember standing in my kitchen, completely still, saying slowly, "I think you have the wrong number," before she read back an address that was unmistakably mine, on a loan application carrying my husband's signature and, more disturbingly, something that looked very much like a forged version of my own. My name is Melissa, and this is the story of the 11 months it took me to fully understand that my husband of 13 years had quietly gambled away nearly $200,000, and the increasingly desperate, increasingly dishonest lengths he'd gone to in order to keep me from finding out. I want to start by explaining what our marriage looked like before any of this came to light, because I think it matters to understanding how something this significant can hide in plain sight for as long as it did. Tom and I met in our late 20s, married 3 years later, built what I genuinely believed, right up until the moment that bank representative called, was a stable, honest partnership. We had 2 kids, Ryan and Ella, then 11 and 8. Tom worked as a regional sales director for a building materials company, a solid, if unglamorous, career that had always provided comfortably for our family. I worked part-time as a physical therapist, primarily to have more flexibility around the kids' schedules, an arrangement Tom and I had discussed and agreed on together years earlier, one that meant Tom's income formed the larger, more structural portion of our household finances. I handled the day-to-day budgeting, groceries, kids' activities, the ordinary rhythm of household spending, while Tom managed our larger financial picture, including our mortgage, our retirement accounts, and, as it turned out, decisions I had no idea he was making at all. The first sign, though I didn't recognize it as significant at the time, came about a year and a half before that phone call, when Tom mentioned, during an otherwise ordinary dinner conversation, that his company had implemented a temporary pay reduction across the sales division due to what he described as a rough quarter industry-wide. I remember feeling a brief flash of concern, followed quickly by reassurance, because Tom presented the situation calmly, framing it as a short-term adjustment that wouldn't meaningfully affect our overall financial stability, something we could absorb comfortably given our existing savings cushion. I didn't question this explanation closely, in the same way most people don't interrogate a spouse's account of their own workplace, trusting the information because trusting your partner's account of their professional life is, under ordinary circumstances, simply what a healthy marriage runs on. I understand now, with the benefit of everything I eventually learned, that this pay reduction story was the first in a long series of fabrications Tom constructed to explain a financial reality that had nothing to do with his actual salary and everything to do with a gambling habit that had, by that point, already been quietly escalating for the better part of 2 years. Over the following months, small financial inconsistencies began accumulating, each individually explainable, each dismissed by me at the time as ordinary household budget fluctuation rather than evidence of anything more serious. A missed payment on a credit card, Tom insisted, was just an automatic payment glitch. A withdrawal from our joint savings account that he explained as covering an unexpected car repair I never actually saw evidence of. A brief, tense conversation about our retirement contribution being temporarily reduced to build up more liquid cash reserves. A decision I now understand was framed in exactly the kind of reasonable-sounding financial language that made it easy for me to accept without pushing for more detail. I want to be honest that I bear some responsibility for how long this went undetected, not because deceiving a spouse is ever justified by the other partner's inattention, but because I think it's important, in telling this story honestly, to acknowledge that Tom and I had, over years of marriage, settled into a financial division of labor that gave him significant unilateral control over decisions I should have been more actively involved in scrutinizing, regardless of how much I trusted him. The phone call that finally broke everything open came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was folding laundry, half listening to a podcast, completely unprepared for the conversation that was about to unravel more than a decade of trust in the span of about 4 minutes. Hi, this is Jennifer calling from Meridian Home Lending. I'm following up on your second mortgage refinancing that closed last month. I wanted to confirm a few final details for our records and make sure everything on your end came through correctly. I remember the specific, disorienting confusion of that opening sentence, my brain trying and failing to locate any memory of applying for, discussing, or in any way participating in a second mortgage on our home. "I think you might have the wrong number," I said, my voice carrying the mild, unbothered confusion of someone assuming a simple administrative mix-up rather than the beginning of a genuine crisis. "Let me just confirm the address," Jennifer said, and read back our home address, precisely, unmistakably correct. I asked her to hold for a moment, my heart beginning to pound in a way that felt entirely disproportionate to what I still assumed, in that moment, was some kind of clerical error. I asked her whose names were on the loan application. It shows Thomas Kessler as the primary applicant, with Melissa Kessler listed as co-signer, she said, and something in her tone shifted slightly, a note of professional caution creeping in, as though some part of her had already begun to sense that this call was heading somewhere more complicated than a routine confirmation. I never signed anything, I said, my voice steadier than I expected given the vertigo building in my chest. I need you to send me a copy of whatever document has my signature on it, right now. What arrived in my email 20 minutes later, while I sat frozen at our kitchen table, was a copy of a home equity loan application, dated 7 weeks earlier, for $140,000, carrying what appeared to be my signature on the cosigner line. A signature I had never provided, on a document I had never seen, authorizing a loan against our home that I had absolutely no knowledge of. I called Tom immediately, my hands shaking so badly I had to try dialing twice. He didn't answer. I called 4 more times over the following 20 minutes, each call going straight to voicemail, before he finally called back, his voice carrying a forced, unconvincing casualness that told me, even before he said a single substantive word, that whatever explanation was coming wouldn't be an innocent one. Hey, sorry, I was in back-to-back meetings. What's going on? I just got off the phone with Meridian Home Lending about a $140,000 home equity loan with my forged signature on it. Explain this to me right now, Tom, or I'm calling a lawyer before you even get home tonight. The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that I genuinely thought the connection had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier casualness. Melissa, I can explain everything. Please, just let me get home, and I'll tell you everything, I promise. Please don't call anyone yet. I want to describe the specific agony of the 2 hours between that phone call and Tom actually walking through our front door, sitting alone in our kitchen, staring at a loan document with my forged signature on it, trying and failing to construct any explanation that didn't involve some form of serious, deliberate deception from the person I'd shared my entire adult life with for over 13 years. What Tom told me that evening, delivered in fragments interrupted by long, guilty silences, revealed a truth far more extensive and far more devastating than I could have imagined sitting alone in that kitchen, bracing myself for whatever explanation was coming. Roughly 2 years earlier, Tom had started gambling online, initially, according to his account, as an occasional, low-stakes activity he engaged in during business travel, something he framed to himself as harmless entertainment rather than anything approaching a genuine problem. Over the following months, what began as occasional entertainment had gradually escalated into something considerably more serious, consuming increasing amounts of both his time and, far more consequentially, our family's money. I remember asking him, during that conversation, when he first realized it had become a genuine problem rather than simply an occasional activity, needing some kind of timeline to help me understand how something this significant had grown for so long without my noticing any of it. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. I think I knew, somewhere around a year ago, that I couldn't stop the way I wanted to. I kept telling myself one more good week would fix everything, that I just needed a lucky stretch to get back to even. And then I'd stop completely, and you'd never need to know any of it happened. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. It never came. The lucky stretch. It just kept getting worse. And every month I didn't tell you felt harder than the month before, until it felt impossible to ever bring it up at all. By the time the pattern had fully calcified into what Tom, during that conversation, finally acknowledged as a genuine addiction, he had already depleted a significant portion of our joint savings, an amount he estimated, though admitted he wasn't entirely certain of the full total himself, somewhere around $60,000 accumulated over roughly a year and a half. Rather than confronting this reality honestly, either with himself or with me, Tom had instead begun constructing an increasingly elaborate series of explanations and, eventually, actual financial maneuvers designed to obscure the growing hole in our finances long enough for him to, as he put it, win it back and fix everything before you ever had to know. The fabricated pay reduction story, I learned, had been Tom's initial attempt to explain a genuine reduction in our disposable income without revealing its actual costs. When that explanation could no longer adequately cover the growing gap between our expenses and our actual available funds, he had begun taking increasingly serious steps. First depleting savings, then, when that proved insufficient, taking out a personal loan under his own name alone roughly 8 months before the phone call from Meridian. A loan I never knew existed until this same devastating evening finally brought the full picture into view. The second mortgage, the one that had finally, accidentally surfaced through Jennifer's routine confirmation call, represented what Tom described as his final, desperate attempt to consolidate his mounting debts into a single, more manageable obligation, one he apparently believed he could quietly manage and eventually pay off without ever needing to have the devastating conversation we were now, finally, actually having. "How did you sign my name?" I asked, my voice barely functioning by that point in the conversation. "How did you forge my signature on a legal document?" Tom's answer to that specific question remains one of the most painful details of this entire situation for me. Even now, well over a year removed from that conversation. He had, apparently, practiced replicating my signature using old documents around our house, eventually developing a version convincing enough to pass the relatively minimal verification process the loan officer, working with what he'd represented as routine, uncomplicated paperwork, had applied to the cosigner's portion of the application. I want to try to describe what it felt like in the days and weeks that followed that conversation, learning not just about a serious, previously hidden gambling addiction, but about the specific, deliberate forgery Tom had committed against me personally, using my own name and identity to legally obligate me to debt I'd never agreed to and never even known existed. It felt, in a way I struggled to fully articulate even to my own therapist in the months that followed, like a betrayal operating on two entirely separate levels simultaneously. The financial devastation itself, and the much more personal violation of having my own legal identity used, without my knowledge or consent, to help conceal that devastation from me for as long as possible. The following weeks involved an exhausting, disorienting process of fully understanding the scope of what we were actually dealing with. I hired my own attorney, separate from any joint representation, understanding almost immediately that my interests and Tom's, however much I still loved him underneath the devastation, were no longer necessarily aligned in navigating what came next. Together, my attorney and a forensic accountant we brought in helped construct a full, accurate accounting of our actual financial position, a process that revealed the total damage to be considerably worse than even Tom's initial, halting confession had suggested. The forensic accountant, a methodical woman named Patrice who specialized in exactly this kind of complex marital financial dispute, spent nearly 3 weeks tracing every account, every transaction, every gap between what Tom had told me and what had actually happened to our money over the preceding 2 years. I remember sitting across from her in her small, cluttered office, watching her build out a timeline on a whiteboard, transaction by transaction, each one representing another small piece of the elaborate concealment Tom had constructed, apparently one desperate decision at a time, without ever fully planning the scope of what it would eventually become. Between the depleted savings, the personal loan Tom had taken out independently, and the forged second mortgage, our family's total financial exposure came to just over $193,000, spread across debts and depleted assets that had accumulated over roughly 2 years of escalating gambling activity Tom had successfully concealed from me for nearly that entire duration. I want to describe the specific legal complexity the forged signature created because it became, in many ways, the central issue my attorney and I had to navigate over the following months. Because my name appeared on the second mortgage application, albeit fraudulently, the lender's initial position treated the debt as a legitimate joint obligation, requiring a formal fraud investigation and extensive documentation to establish that I had, in fact, never authorized or signed the loan myself. This process took nearly 4 months to fully resolve, involving handwriting analysis, a review of security footage from the notary office where the fraudulent signing had apparently taken place, and Tom's own, eventually cooperative, formal acknowledgement of what he'd done, submitted as part of the process required to release me from legal responsibility for a debt I'd never agreed to. I remember sitting in a small conference room with my attorney and a bank compliance officer, watching security footage from the notarization appointment, seeing Tom sign a document under my name, in front of an actual notary public who had no way of knowing the signature wasn't genuinely mine, a moment that still, even now, produces a specific, sick feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it too directly. Tom entered a gambling addiction treatment program roughly 6 weeks after our initial devastating conversation, a decision he made, as far as I can tell, out of genuine recognition of how completely his addiction had damaged our family, rather than simply as a strategic move to salvage our marriage. I want to be fair in acknowledging that his engagement with treatment appeared genuine, involving weekly individual therapy alongside a structured group program specifically for gambling addiction, along with financial counseling designed to help him develop healthier, more transparent patterns going forward. I separated from Tom during this same period, moving with the kids into a rental apartment while we worked through both the practical, legal untangling of our finances and the larger, harder question of whether our marriage could survive a betrayal this extensive. I want to be honest that this question remained genuinely uncertain for months. My trust in him fundamentally shattered in a way that his engagement with treatment, however sincere, couldn't immediately repair. We eventually decided, after nearly 8 months of separation, extensive individual and couples therapy, and Tom's continued, consistent engagement with his recovery program, to attempt reconciliation, though on terms significantly different from the financial arrangement that had allowed his addiction to remain hidden for as long as it had. We now maintain fully transparent, jointly reviewed finances, with automated alerts on every account that notify both of us of any transaction above a modest threshold, along with a formal financial power of attorney arrangement that would prevent either of us from independently taking on significant debt without the other's explicit, documented consent. A safeguard my attorney helped design specifically to prevent any possibility of a repeat of what happened with the forged mortgage. Our couples therapist, a careful, direct woman named Dr. Ferreira who specialized in rebuilding trust after financial infidelity specifically, helped us develop what she called a verification period, 18 months during which Tom would provide full, proactive transparency about every financial decision, however small, not because I demanded constant surveillance of his every move, but because Dr. Ferreira explained that rebuilding genuine trust after this kind of deception requires consistent, demonstrated honesty over an extended period, rather than simply an initial confession followed by an assumption that trust automatically resets. I want to be clear that reconciliation isn't the outcome every marriage facing this kind of devastating betrayal should or does reach, and I don't offer our decision as some kind of universal template for how to handle discovering a spouse's hidden addiction and financial deception. What ultimately factored into our decision was a combination of Tom's demonstrated, sustained commitment to genuine recovery over many months rather than a quick, superficial apology, along with my own careful, therapist-guided assessment of whether rebuilding trust felt genuinely possible rather than simply hoped for. The financial recovery process took considerably longer than the emotional one, in some ways. Between debt consolidation, a structured repayment plan for the personal loan, and the eventual formal release from liability on the fraudulent second mortgage, it took just over a year to fully stabilize our family's financial position, a process that required significant lifestyle adjustments neither of us had ever anticipated needing to make. Canceling a planned family vacation, pulling Ryan out of a travel sports league that had become financially unsustainable given our restructured budget, decisions that affected our children in ways that, even now, I feel a complicated mixture of necessary practicality and lingering guilt about. Understanding that consequences of Tom's hidden addiction ultimately touched every member of our family, not just the two of us directly negotiating its financial and legal fallout. Ryan and Ella know a simplified, age-appropriate version of what happened. That dad went through a difficult period and made some serious mistakes with money that took time to fix, without the full specific details about gambling addiction or forgery that felt appropriate to share with children their age. Tom has been honest with them, in developmentally appropriate ways, about the fact that he's actively working on becoming healthier and more trustworthy. Language our family therapist helped us develop specifically to be truthful without burdening our kids with details beyond what they genuinely needed to understand. It's been just over 2 years since that first disorienting phone call from Jennifer at Meridian Home Lending. Tom remains actively engaged in his recovery program, and our finances have stabilized considerably, though we maintain the transparent, jointly monitored system we established during our reconciliation, understanding that ongoing vigilance, rather than simply restored trust alone, is what actually protects our family from a repeat of what happened. I think, most often, about the specific, narrow chance that led to this all coming to light when it did. Jennifer's routine confirmation call, made for entirely ordinary administrative reasons, happening to reach me directly rather than Tom, who had presumably intended to manage that final piece of paperwork himself, the same way he'd managed to keep every other piece of the unraveling situation contained for nearly 2 years before that single, accidental phone call finally broke it open. If you've ever discovered that a spouse had been hiding a serious financial crisis, or had gone so far as to forge your signature or identity to help conceal it, I want to hear how you navigated finding your way through it, whatever that path ultimately looked like for your family. I used to believe that shared finances between spouses were inherently transparent, simply by virtue of the trust and partnership marriage is built on. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that trust and transparency aren't actually the same thing, and that sometimes the person you've shared your entire adult life with can construct an elaborate, hidden reality running in parallel to the one you both believed you were building together, until something as ordinary as a routine confirmation call finally, accidentally lets the truth through.